Good evening again, everyone. We're continuing in John 18 tonight in the Gospel accounts. I thought I would start with just doing a summary, if you will. I'll back up to where we were last time. We started in this account going through the scourging, the flogging that Christ endured the second time as he was brought before Pilate. And we see that discussion that went back and forth between the Pharisees as they tried to incite, if you will, Pilate to have Christ crucified. They kept changing the charges because Pilate wasn't interested in their charges of heresy. They had to make it a capital crime, which is why they settled on Christ as king, knowing that he would have to deal with that. Pilate would. And then, of course, we'll see tonight, they kind of hold his feet to the fire that if he doesn't follow through on this, they'll, basically make his life miserable because they can bring charges against him to Rome, Caesar. So to continue in John 18, verse 11, we left off with Pilate basically it depends on the tone. You can read this a couple of different ways. In some ways, you can see Pilate's frustration because Christ was not responding to him. And so Pilate asked the question, "Don't you know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" That was in John 18, verse 10. Essentially saying, you see this ambivalence that Pilate had, that he didn't really want to do this, and yet he was doing it because, again, he was a weak leader. He was bowing to the pressure of the Jewish leadership just so there wouldn't be any problems. But yet he seemed concerned that if this was the Son of God, what would be his responsibility in this? Whether he understood fully what that meant or not, probably didn't really, but there was something there that created enough of a hesitancy. And so he's asking this question. So in John 18, verse 11, Christ finally does answer him and says, that you would have no power over me if unless it was given to you from above. And so we have verses like Daniel 2 where it talks about God setting up and tearing down these various authorities that we know as the Son of God. He would have had this power as well. In Romans 13, I'll read that one to you, verses 1 and 2. Paul writes here, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." So even in this process of crucifixion, we see Christ submitting to the authorities. Now we know it also was necessary for the fulfillment of prophecy, for God's plan of salvation for mankind, and for so many other things that were foretold. But still, he didn't revile, he didn't condemn, he didn't get angry. He submitted himself, if you will, in the whole process, as much of a sham as it was. So Romans 13, verse 2, "Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." And so in this, we also see a condemnation, if you will, to the Jewish leadership, because he says here in verse 11, "You would have no power at all over me you would have no power at all against me unless it were given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." The Jewish leadership knew it was a sham, but they justified it in their mind that the death of one man was necessary so that it wouldn't be the death of a nation. That's what they reasoned in their minds, that if this guy could go away, then we would have less problems with the Romans. Everything would go back to the way it was before he stirred the pot up here. And so he's saying this, whether any of the Jews present understood anything he was saying, they probably didn't, but they certainly didn't think that it had anything to do with them. So then verse 12, after Christ says this, Pilate was in his mind. This is why I say back in verse 10, it almost seems like he's looking for an opening that Christ would give him, that he could stop this. Because it says Pilate was seeking to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man." So he must have said something publicly. He must have maybe expressed his doubts in some regards, as he's already done several times. I find no fault in this man. But they say here, crying out, if you release this man, you aren't Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. So they're putting Pilate in a corner here, and he knows this because his relationship with the Jews was not a very good one over the course of time. He, as governor of the region, reigned longer than most did. I think it was close to 12 years that he reigned in the area. But there were a number of things that he had done over the years that really, really got under the skin of the Jews. Um, one of which was that shortly after coming into the area, he put the standard. Now, this is the pole that has the insignia of Caesar, and in battle, it would have the insignia underneath that of the legion, the troops as they went out. And this was considered sacred to the point where if that standard was captured by the enemy, they would go through great effort in spending troops and material to get that standard back because they saw it not just as a physical sign of the legion, of the troops of Caesar. They saw it as sacred. And so when Pilate came into the region, he took the standard of the emperor and placed it outside the temple, in the temple area, not in the temple itself, but outside the temple. This highly inflamed the Jews. They saw that as blasphemous. That was no different than if you'd put the idol in the temple itself. There was a riot. There were many that died in that. Many say unnecessarily, historians. Um, and then later on, there was money that was needed to repair one of the aqueducts that brought water to Jerusalem or near it. And Pilate didn't have money from Rome, didn't have enough money in the taxes, and so he raided the treasury of the temple, took that money for the repairs, and of course that incites the Jews to a great deal as well. So these are some of the things that happened. And then even after they make this charge here, that if you don't do this, we're going to tell Caesar you're not his friend, that you're not ruling in his best interest. Later on, then they call it a slaughter. That's a little, well, quite a bit of hyperbole there. It wasn't a slaughter per se, but the Jews also had their own sacredness, and at times they would get into almost like the Catholics with their relic worship. The Jews believed that there were many items, holy items they considered of Moses's that was kept at Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim was north of Jerusalem, up in the area of the Samaritans. And Mount Gerizim, if you remember, was considered also a holy mountain by the Samaritans. They believed that's where Abraham offered Isaac. They believed that was the mountain on which they should worship, not going down to Jerusalem. If you remember Jesus's interaction with the Samaritan woman. So they had their own views, if you will, the Jews did, of these things. And there was an individual that stirred up a group that many supported that basically said that he was the reincarnation of Moses and that he was going to lead the people up to the top of the mountain and he was going to unearth these holy relics of Moses, and it would usher in a new era for Judah. The Samaritans got involved as well. Of course, and you have these great uprisings like this, it tends to get the attention of the Roman authorities, and so Pilate sent up troops, about 1,000 troops, and beat back the crowds, stopped this rising up, if you will, and he executed all the leaders of the group. That was the one that was sort of the last straw. And what we know of Pilate disappears after that. He evidently was summoned, and there's mixed stories as to who told him to go back to Rome, but he was going to go back to Rome to basically explain himself based on the historical accounts. And from the Roman perspective, he shouldn't have really been in any trouble. But of course, the people were unsettled. But before he could get to Rome, Caesar died. This was Tiberius. And Pilate's case got lost in the shuffle, if you will. but history loses track of Pilate at that time. Many historians believe that he simply retired. We know he's no longer governor of Judea, but we don't know where he went, where he ended up. So that's Pilate's relationship. It was very much not even a love-hate relationship. It was a tolerate-hate relationship. And so these sort of statements, as we read here in John 18, verse 13, show, the Jews were not above or beyond provoking Pilate as well, with their own innuendos and false charges and so forth. So, John 18, verse 13, when Pilate heard these words from the Jewish leaders, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat, the place called the pavement in the Hebrew Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover. And this is where most Christians lose track of the timing, because in their mind, the only preparation day is the Friday before a Sabbath, not realizing that any day before a holy day would also be a preparation day, because the holy day is like a Sabbath as well. No common work, and no business and all of these things that we're familiar with. So this day is Wednesday because of the timing. We know he was resurrected late Saturday afternoon. 31 AD is the only year that fits the timing, which means Thursday would have been the first day of unleavened bread. We know that Christ has already kept Passover, so that would have been what we call Tuesday night. It would have been the beginning of the 14th. So all of this, Christ before Pilate, going back and forth between Herod and Pilate, all the charges with the Jews before the Sanhedrin, middle of the night actually. So all of this is playing out on Wednesday, prior to the holy day. So John is the only one who makes that statement, so we know exactly when the timing of this was. So continuing in verse 14, it says about the 6th hour. So this is getting close to about 9 o'clock in the morning, which again highlights how much of this was done under cover of darkness. Christ in the garden was taken at night, late, what we would call Tuesday night. The trial before the Sanhedrin, and then coming before Pilate. All these things were rushed. It's what we call a kangaroo court. There was a foregone conclusion. They went through the motions. So this is still very early in the morning. So he says to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." Pilate responds to them saying, "Shall I crucify your king?" And they said, "We have no king but Caesar," to reinforce what they set up in verse 12. They're pretending to be loyal subjects to Rome when they hated everything about the Roman rule and the Roman culture. They thought all of that beneath them. They just detested being part of it. But here it served their purpose. But they made the charge, the Jews did, that Christ was claiming to be king, which he did. He is king. But of course, the nuance is lost not only on the Jews, but on Pilate in this case. But Pilate seems to be provoking them a little bit, even though he acquiesced to killing Christ for them. He seems to be goading them a bit. So in Luke's account, Luke 23, verse 23 here, it says they were urgent. So they were pressing the point here with Pilate with loud voices, and the voices of the chief priests prevailed. And the chief priests were the ones stirring up the people to demand also this from Pilate, so that he would have pressure to crucify Jesus Christ. Now, what's ironic here is, of course, the Jews were to only have God as their king, but to get what they wanted here, they're saying we have no king but Caesar. So then moving to Matthew 27, verse 24, Pilate, seeing that nothing could be gained, okay, it's a foregone conclusion. To press the point anymore is just going to make the people more angry, create more problems he has to deal with, and so forth. So because there was nothing more to be gained, but rather that a disturbance was starting, he took water, a bowl, had somebody bring him a bowl of water, washed his hands symbolically, if you will, and said, "I am innocent of the blood of this righteous person. You see it to it." Now, he wasn't completely honest, because he could have stopped the whole thing here. He says, I am innocent of the blood of this righteous person. He knew Christ had not done what they said he had done. He did not deserve to die, but he's already scourged him, flogged him, trying to placate them. That didn't satisfy them. So now he goes through this process, and they kept pressing the point. So verse 25 of Matthew 27, it says, all the people answered, may his blood be on us and on our children. And this verse is contentious in a lot of circles. There are some that say it's not in some of the manuscripts, and that's true. That's primarily the Alexandrian manuscripts, and that's not uncommon. The Alexandrian manuscripts don't have things that are in the Byzantine manuscripts. But what's more contentious about this is that over the centuries, many have used this verse to justify persecution of the Jews. Now, we know that God doesn't hold children responsible for the sins of their parents. There can be patterns that can be established, and so sin can continue from generation to generation. That's a different topic. But what seems to be the case here is, if this is indeed true, and I have no reason to doubt that it's not, since God recorded it, that this is in part of what is what happens around 70 AD, and we'll come to that in a little bit. Because many see this fulfilled when the temple was destroyed, but we know that this is not a forever forsaking, if you will, of the people of Israel. That we know that all of Israel, from Romans 11 and many other places, will have opportunity for salvation. So then Matthew 28, verse 26, so he released to them Barabbas. If you remember earlier, it was a tradition of his on the Passover to release a prisoner to them, to show his magnanimity. And so he had thought that they would choose Jesus, but they kept asking for Barabbas. Barabbas was a murderer. He was swept up in a rebellion. He was also a thief, as we'll see here in a little bit. But he released Barabbas. That's the one they asked for. And so then Jesus, he delivered to the soldiers to again be flogged. So this is twice that now he is flogged. And this is not just the whipping on the back. Again, it's with that instrument, what we would call cat o' nine tails, that was designed to bruise the flesh deeply. It was designed to tear open the flesh, and it was designed to extract a lot of blood, so the person would become very weak. And so he goes through this a second time. Mark and Luke's account says the same thing, but Luke, in Luke 23, verse 25, says Pilate released him, Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. So Barabbas wasn't an innocent man like Christ was, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus up to their will. And so in John's account here, in John 18, verse 16, they delivered him to be crucified. Now, we think of crucified in terms of the death, but crucifixion was the process. The flogging was the initial step, but the crucifixion itself was when they were attached to the post or the cross, and that's when they went through the process of dying. Having the arms nailed above their heads or with arms outstretched, they couldn't take full breaths. They would slowly suffocate. It was designed to be a long, drawn-out death. If for whatever reason they needed to end the crucifixion, they would typically break the legs, because that was the only way they could push up to take pressure off their rib cage so they could take a breath. And if their legs were broken, they couldn't push up because of pain or just because of leverage, and they would asphyxiate. Now, it's interesting that Christ didn't have his legs broken. We'll see that when we come to it in probably a couple of further studies down the road. But if his legs had been broken, he would have died of suffocation, not from blood loss. And the Old Testament sacrifices were never to be strangled. They were to have their throats cut, they were to be bled out. It was the blood that was collected, it was put on the horns of the altar. God considered the blood sacred, and Christ went through the very same symbolic aspects of sacrifices so that he could become the perfect sacrifice for us. So again, we're about at 9 o'clock Wednesday morning in the timing of everything. So then, as he was delivered to be crucified, he's brought to the Roman soldiers. And normally, you would have what's called a quaternion, 4 soldiers out of 16. And these 4 soldiers would be assigned, well, all 16 would be assigned to a duty. They would divide the day into 4 watches, and so there'd be 4 soldiers for each watch. And in this case, those soldiers, those 4, were the ones who went through the process of beginning the crucifixion. So in Matthew's account, Matthew 27, verse 28, I just remembered as I was finishing up that last section, I said Matthew 28 in one of the references, so I apologize for saying the wrong chapter. So Matthew 27, verse 27 says, Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the Praetorium. And again, the Praetorium was the area between Herod's palace and where the governor would be when he was in the area to hear cases and make decisions and so forth. So it was an open courtyard. This is not the temple complex. This is not the Fortress Antonium. It was not those areas. This was on the southwest area of Old Jerusalem. So coming down the hillside from the temple area. So they're in the Praetorium. It says they gathered the whole garrison. So all the other soldiers as well that would have been in the fortress. It says they stripped him. They put a scarlet robe on him. Now, Mark's account says purple. Mark 15, verse 17. And some will try to make that as a point of error. You know, somebody didn't get their story right. That's not the case. The problem is the Greek is unclear. How do you describe a color? If I said yellow to you, how do you describe that? If I say scarlet to you, how do you describe that? Scarlet is red. Purple is what many will call a blue red. And the word used in the Greek can have both. So the color can depend whether it's scarlet or purple, how much of the dye was used. It's not critical. It's just an explanation of why there could be 2 different interpretations here. I learned years ago in the printing work that I did, no 2 people see color the same way. When I was doing press runs, I could look at the proofs coming off the press and I could say, well, that looks too yellow. And the pressmen standing there were saying, no, that's right. It's probably, not enough blue or something. Everybody sees color differently. It's only the point I'm making here. But the soldiers here we see have no skin in the game, as I have there in my notes, and to them they become so detached from these things. Soldiers are used to killing, right? They're used to destroying things, so they're not emotionally invested in any of this. This is just another task that they have. Jesus is just another criminal that they're crucifying, and so to try to make it interesting, they would do different things. And so in this case here, they throw this robe on him to mock him. And in Mark's account, Mark 15:17, it says they clothed him with purple, they wove a crown of thorns, and they put it on. These thorns would be used in the braziers as fuel for these little fires. So think a plant stand with a bowl on top, and you'd have a small fire in there, usually with coals, and it would give off a little bit of heat. You could come warm your hands and so forth on some chilly nights. But these thorns would be a common fuel that they would use, and so they took evidently strands of this, however many feet long, a couple feet long, and they take several of them and they sort of wove them together and made a crown. So it's not just that was handy, but then they also took this and they probably pressed it down. And again, the skull's skin, the skin on the skull rather, is very thin. You're not going to push it through the bone, but you're going to break the skin. And so then he's also probably bleeding from his head because those blood vessels are very close under the skin surface. And so now he's bleeding even further from this. We know then from both accounts, Mark 15 and Matthew 27, that they mock him. They say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And both accounts, Mark 15:19, Matthew 27:30, it says they spit on him and struck him on the head. In Mark's account, they also struck him with a reed, not just his like an open hand. Don't think just a slap. This would have been a fairly hard hit. I mean, they're beating on the prisoner, if you will, but they mock him by bowing their knees as if they're giving homage to a true king. And so this is just more of the humiliation that was designed in this whole process. Crucifixion was designed to be humiliating as well. It would be drawn out, but it would be humiliating for the person going through it. They would be near naked, if not naked. They would be crucified in a very public area by design. The Romans wanted everybody to see this process and to know if they did something similar, this was the fate they would go through. Before I leave the area, Mark 15:16, Mark uses the word cohort. And the numbers vary historically depending on what you read, but it's probably around 300 to 400 men, where Matthew's account says the whole garrison. So it could have been all of the soldiers, not likely. They wouldn't have left everything else exposed if there'd been some other uprising or need for soldiers to be sent out in the temple area or something. So it was probably just a group. All right, so then we move to the actual crucifixion. So in Matthew's account, it says when they had mocked him, they took the robe off of him. So that scarlet or purple robe they put on him was probably one of the soldiers. So they take that off, they put his clothes back on him, and they lead him out. And Matthew's account and Luke's account and Mark's account all identify the individual that now carries the cross piece, the horizontal piece. If it's not the horizontal piece, because the starios in the Greek is the post, but we know from historical accounts and illustrations that survive that it could be basically like a capital T, or it could be just a post. Anciently, the Persians and initially even the Romans would use a tree, which is why Christ even quoted that, where it said, he said, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." The Romans refined it over time, and they would use these. So whether it was the single post, whether it was the crossbeam, Christ starts out carrying this. And we read that in John 19 and verse 17. It says, he went out bearing his cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. Now, the exact location of Golgotha is still disputed to this day. Most think that it was on the north side of the city, but we don't know for sure. Some think that it was called Place of a Skull because in the limestone areas around Jerusalem, there is an area where there were natural caves in the limestone that sort of resembled the image or the look of a skull, which is probably why it was called that. But anyway, that's where they were going to have this crucifixion. As I started to say, in Matthew and Mark and Luke's account, they see that Christ is not able to carry this, which is understandable. Again, he's been flogged twice, so he's lost a lot of blood. He didn't sleep, right? Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, he was awake the whole night. So he was up from whatever time he got up Tuesday morning, he's still up. So he's been awake for more than 24 hours. He's been going through the flogging twice. He's lost a lot of blood. So it's understandable he doesn't have strength to carry this. And a post, how much does that post weigh? Even if it only weighed 20, 30 pounds, which isn't unbearable in normal circumstances, with the loss of blood, the loss of sleep, the trauma to his body. Again, he's bruised. He's starting to feel that. He's starting to probably go into the initial stages of shock. in terms of his body. He just doesn't have the strength. So they impress a man called Simon. He's from Cyrene. Now, what's interesting is he's named, one of the very few individuals named in the ministry of Jesus Christ. We have some, not a lot. And in this case, he's the only one mentioned during the crucifixion, specifically by name outside of the women that we'll come to here in a moment. It seems possible because there is a Rufus. Cyrene is called the father of Alexander and Rufus in Mark 15:21. So even the sons are identified. Many have wondered if in Romans 16:13 a Rufus is mentioned. Let me just read that quickly to you since I'm still open to Romans. It says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine." So Paul knew this individual as well. Cyrene was the region west of Egypt on North Africa, which many then say he was probably a convert, not a Jew of the diaspora. That's not necessarily important. He was there in the crowd. And just through time and chance, the Romans pulled him out and said, "You carry the cross then." This was called Angaria. The Romans would impress somebody into service. Christ even mentioned this in early in his ministry, right? If you're asked for your cloak, give them your coat as well. If they ask you to go a mile, go 2 miles. The Romans could do this. This was one of the things when this country was founded that we said the government couldn't do. Because even up through the times of the founding of this nation, the government came into town, they had soldiers, they would just take over your house, they would take over your barns, your stalls, they would use whatever foods or resources you had, and they had no obligation to pay for any of it. They could damage it, they could use it to defend their positions, it could get destroyed. So the Romans did the same thing. Most ancient cultures did. And so, as Mark says here at the end of verse 21, that he might bear Jesus's cross. So Christ is being led by the soldiers. Simon is behind him. Simon was a very common name, especially because of Simon Maccabee. So that was a very common name. So they're headed towards this place called Golgotha. So in Luke 23, verse 27, Luke picks up most of the account then here. And he says, "A great multitude of the people followed him, including women who also mourned and lamented him." Now, if you remember when the mob came with the chief priests in the Garden of Gethsemane, all the disciples fled, basically. They all left him. Now we know John was there, we know Peter was there, we don't know if others were in the crowds as this mock trial went on. John seems to disappear then as Christ goes between Herod and Pilate. We don't hear of any of the disciples, but we'll see John come back into the picture at the crucifixion, and John is the only one mentioned of the disciples being at the crucifixion. But there are the women. The women seem to, during Christ's ministry, be the ones that helped support him, if you will. So they followed. It was their homes they stayed in oftentimes, Christ and the disciples. They were the ones that fed him. They were the ones that were part of those that followed and so forth. But there's also this great multitude. So, I mean, you can imagine the show that this is in Jerusalem, if you will. The Jews, again, they hated the Romans, but Jesus was very notable that this would have been, to use a term, it would have been a very exciting thing to witness because this man had made such an impact, and now he's going to be crucified. You also probably have all the high priests and their entourage and parts of the Sanhedrin and many of the crowd that were there just wanting to see this whole thing through. So this crowd is following them as well. But you can imagine the trauma that this is for the women, later for the disciples as well. They understood this is the Messiah. They understood the prophecies, but they thought that he was coming to fulfill everything in his first coming. They didn't yet understand that he came first to be our sacrifice, to pay for our sins. Later, he's coming as king. And they're very distraught about this, which is understandable. So Luke 23 and verse 28, but Jesus turned to them, to the women that lamented him. Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children, because he knows what's coming, not only in 70 AD, but down through time, and then also especially in the end time. To continue, he says, behold, the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that were never nursed, because things are going to get so bad. Then they will begin to tell the mountains, fall on us, and tell the hills, cover us, because there's going to be so much death, so much destruction, so much pain, so much suffering on such scale that they would rather die than try to endure it. And we saw that historically in 70 AD. It was not a time to be in Jerusalem. It was an ugly, ugly chapter in the history of the Jewish people. The cannibalism that took place, the severe violence that took place. The Romans had sieged the city. There was nothing going in or out, so food became scarce. They had water source, but you had these mobs roaming around, and if they thought anybody had anything of value and they didn't get it right away, they would kill people, and oftentimes they would just kill them anyway. It was so bad when the Romans finally breached the walls and took over the city. They were stunned at what they saw. The historical accounts talk about how even they were shocked at how awful it was within the city walls. But then Christ in verse 31 here says, for if they do these things in the green tree, what will be done in the dry? Which is essentially him saying, if they're going to do this to me when I'm alive, what will they do to you when I'm dead? Not very encouraging when you think about the words, but this is all part of the process, isn't it? Christ didn't promise us a simple life, a life of no trial, a life of ease. In fact, he told the opposite. He said, they will persecute you, they will hate you for my name's sake. And we can be overwhelmed by that, or we can seek to be strengthened in God so we can go through those times. And historically, that's the only thing that's gotten God's people through those times. So then Luke also comes back to the two criminals. If you remember, there were others when Pilate was flogging and pulling. Again, these were people of insurrection. These were true rebellious insurrectionists. And so these two criminals are going to be crucified with him to be put to death. And so then they come to the place called the Skull. And then to go back to Matthew's account, Matthew 27 and verse 33, they came to Golgotha, the place of the skull. They gave him sour wine to drink mixed with gall. When he had tasted it, he would not drink. So all accounts have skipped ahead to him being affixed to the cross, the stauros. And it was not uncommon that someone going through crucifixion would be given this drink, and it would probably act as a mild pain sedative. When Christ tasted it and realized what it was, he didn't want anything to do with it. He was not going to go through this not feeling any pain. And it's not that he had to feel the pain, but again, he's fulfilling what the sacrifices represented in the Old Testament. And those animals were not drugged. And so he was not going to be drugged as well. There is also then the connection to Psalm 69 here, verse 21, where well, let me just go back and read that for you. Another prophecy from the Old Testament that's brought forward during this time. Psalm 69. And in verse 21, it says, they also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. So you can imagine that he would want something to drink here because, again, he's lost a lot of blood. His body has gone through a lot of trauma, and he's lost a lot of fluids, bodily fluids from that blood. His body is beginning to get very dehydrated as well. So you can imagine just that physical response of wanting something to drink, that he would initially taste it. Once he tasted it and knew what it was, then he refused any more of it. So then to continue, we come to the next section, which is the first 3 hours of crucifixion. In the timing of the day, this is roughly 9 a.m. to around noon, Wednesday, before the Holy Day. So this crucifixion is not a short process. As I said, it was designed to drag out, but it won't drag out very long, longer than anyone would want to go through, that's for sure. But still, in context of how it was normally done, it won't be drug out, because the Jews required the bodies to be buried before the Holy Day. So Matthew 27, verse 35 says, when they had crucified him. So again, this is the process. He is affixed to the stauros. The post is in the ground. And the prisoners are beginning to go through the process of feeling this inability to take a deep breath, the pain that's surging through. As you can imagine, a lot of illustrations you might be able to see there on the screen would have a block where their feet would be affixed as well, because their feet couldn't be flat to the post. Otherwise, their legs would have to be raised really high. So it would have a little bit of an angle to it, so they couldn't stand on it comfortably. But if they needed to take a deep breath, they would push on that block. But then also, they went through the flogging, right? All of their back is torn up. It's an open wound, not only from the welts of the whips, but the tearing of the flesh. And so every time they moved up and down, it would scrape their backs against this post. More pain would go through their body. And so this is the whole process. He's crucified in that he's affixed to the post. And so now the soldiers with him, remember there are 4 primarily, they divide his clothes among him. And so many have speculated, because it says they divided the clothes, casting lots, but then they also cast lot for his cloak, which was of such nice quality. So Matthew notes that they fulfilled the prophecy there, that they divided my garment among them and they cast lots. Mark doesn't mention the reference to the prophecy, but he does mention casting lots for it. Mark mentions, Mark 15:25, that it was the 3rd hour. So you have a difference in timing. John seemed to use the Roman time, and Mark seems to be using the Jewish reckoning of time. And so you have to keep those differences in mind. It's still around 9 o'clock. The 3rd hour would have been of the day watch, the 3rd hour of daylight. Luke records that he's crucified and the criminals are there, but in Luke 23:34, he is the only one that records Christ's statement here. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. I suspect Luke is the one that records this, because Luke seems to have interviewed Mary, Jesus's mother, for a lot of his account. So Luke's account is more from his mother's perspective, and we know she was there. We'll come to that in a moment as well. But the first statement, as he is hanging on the cross, the stauros, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And so again, dividing his garments among them, they cast lots. John's account, John 19, says that Christ was in the middle. So, I mean, that's not a critical element, but it just shows that John was there. He saw, and it was notable to him for some reason, and that's what he recorded. One criminal on one side, one criminal on the other, Christ in the middle. In John's account, John 19, verse 23, it says, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and made 4 parts, again, 4 soldiers, to every soldier a part. meaning a piece of clothing. So that could have been a turban. Don't think a hat, think more of a cloth that's wrapped. This could also be used for sun protection. It could be used for a makeshift purse, if you will, to carry things, items. You would have had sandals, obviously. You would have had an inner and an outer garment. And then, depending on the season, you could have a cloak for the cooler weather. This was spring in Judea. You could have very, very chilly nights. And so Christ had the cloak with him as well. But it says at the end of verse 23 in John 19, it says the tunic, what we would call the cloak, was without seam, woven from the top throughout. So very fine quality, very well made. So they say to one another, verse 24, let's not tear it, but cast lots to decide whose it will be. So of the four, only one of them would get the cloak. Now you might ask, well, why did they want these clothes? They didn't really care about this. But again, these are soldiers. And to find a way to make these things not drudgery, part of what they would do is they would do a side hustle, we would say. And they would take these clothes and they would go sell them after the crucifixion, make a little pocket money. And so this is what they're doing here. The casting of lots would make it kind of exciting. Am I going to get the piece or not? You know, we think dice, you know, casting lots that way. And this is a reference now to Psalm 22, verse 18. They parted my garments among them, for my cloak they cast lots. And so the soldiers, probably unknowingly, fulfilled prophecy as well here. So then Matthew, Mark, and John all record that Pilate writes an inscription on a piece of wood, probably, and has it affixed to the cross above Christ. This was probably done before they set it in the ground, which would make it easier, obviously, while it was on the ground, affixing the person to the post or the cross. And all three record Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, this would be sort of a cheeky statement because this was the indictment, right? This was the charge that was given that led to him being crucified, that he was claiming to be a king above Caesar. Insurrection, a traitor. So in Matthew 27, verse 37, in Mark 15, verse 26, and in John 19, verse 19, they all have this account. But it's all slightly different. And again, this is not a point of error. This is not showing that Scripture is not inspired. Anybody that has sat through a sermon, even if I have a PowerPoint up on the screen, you ask three people, you're going to get a slightly different rendering from three different people of the same information. Now, also bear in mind that it was said earlier that it was in Hebrew, and it was in Greek, and it was in Latin. Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire. Greek was the official business language of business, common language of business, and of course Hebrew, because that's where they were. I'm sorry, that's the next verse in John 19, verse 20. It says, "For many of the Jews read this title. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek." And so that's part of why there's also this differences. I mean, if you read it in Latin and translate it, it's going to read slightly different if you read it in Greek and translate it. So Mark's account makes note, Mark 15:27. Again, the robbers are with him, one on each side. John did that earlier. But Mark makes the note here that it says, according to Scripture, he was counted with the transgressors. And that's Isaiah 53, verse 12. You start seeing all of these verses from the Old Testament that no one knew what they meant until this moment. And even later, the apostles, as they went out, we see this, especially with Paul, since he wrote so much of what we now have in the New Testament. You know, how many times he goes back to the Old Testament scriptures and sees that connection. That's also an aspect of the Holy Spirit, as God said. It'll give you remembrance of these things. So back to John's account, John 19 and verse 21, the chief priests didn't like this. They didn't like that Pilate had put this statement, if you will, above the head of Christ. And they said, don't write the King of the Jews, but rather write, he said, I am king of the Jews. Then in verse 22, Pilate says, I have written what I've written. I mean, I'm not changing it at this point. It's there. It's going to stand. And this shows the back and forth again of Pilate. Pilate's done messing with these guys. He's fed up with them. He doesn't have any respect for them for what they did, but yet he's vacillated, isn't he? He has allowed this sham to take place, but in this moment he's done. He's not having any of it, and he says, "No, I'm not changing it." Um, so then Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that you get this mocking and this derision from the crowd. So in Matthew 27, verse 39, those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads. Mark says the same thing. Mark 15:29. They passed by blaspheming, wagging their heads, but he records their statements. Ha! You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Let's see you do that now that you're dying. But even in that statement, going back to Psalm 22, verses 7 and 8, they're fulfilling prophecy. They should have known this. They knew the Old Testament scriptures. They should have. Luke simply records the people stood watching. For many, it was a very sad and traumatic time. For most of the city, it was probably just something newsworthy. I was there. This guy, it seemed to have a lot of good things to say, but evidently he wasn't a man of God since he allowed him to be killed. And it was probably a very mixed bag, if you will, in terms of reactions from the crowd. This continues on with those same scriptures. Matthew picks up the story, but we're close to the conclusion of everything. And rather than rush that part as well, we'll pick it up next time with Matthew 27, verse 40. It's more of the mocking, that he's on the cross. We find that even the two criminals initially join in with the mocking, which you would think, wait a minute, they're in the same situation, but they sort of get swept up in the emotion of everything. And then later, one of them doesn't recant necessarily, but he changes how he interacts and says, look, we're guilty here, but this man is innocent. So we'll go through those verses: Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and there's a few verses the end of John 19. All right, so we'll conclude it there for this evening.